Part 1 explored how Buddhism began to make substantial growth in the West in the 1960s. The 70s saw the first wave of Western converts beginning to teach the Dharma to other Westerners, and faced the formidable challenge of adapting Asian teaching forms and institutions to modern sensibilities. Now in Part 2, our road movie continues, seeking out many of the first generation of Western-born Buddhist teachers to look through their eyes at some critical questions. Whether the actual content of Buddhism, will it transform beyond recognition? Will it retain its spiritual depth in the shallow seas of modern materialism? Will it survive at all?
I have a fear that in 50 years' time, Buddhist centers will look a bit like theosophical lodges do to us today. Filled with rather elderly people, rather out of touch with the current world, and persisting in their rituals and practices as though nothing much had changed.
Now, a lot of the Dharma teachers have said that they're noticing there are fewer and fewer younger people in the retreats. Noah, our son, who's a meditation teacher, has often said that there's more and more gray heads. The ocean that's the audience is more and more gray. There's more gray more fleck on the waves.
My hope is that the depth of practice will not be lost. You can see how easy it would be for some of the most precious, most powerful practices that I've been able to do and have learned, how they can be passed on to people who are not willing or not able to devote large chunks of time that way.
Particularly reincarnation. That, to me, is the one point that I've struggled with, probably since the very, very beginning.
I don't think that there's any way in which we can dispense of the concept of reincarnation and truly practice Buddhism in a serious way.
There have to be Westerners who've experienced awakening. There's no doubt about it.
One of the great obstacles, I think, in Western Buddhism is the fact that Western people, in their materialistic arrogance, cannot imagine an extraordinary person.
What I'm resisting, and I think what is counterproductive, is the idea of a state of mind or being that is attainable by an individual, that then makes you somehow superhuman.
Always remain in contact with the roots. And the branches can fall down, and it's not so important if we maintain the roots.
But what are the roots? All Buddhists agree that the Four Noble Truths and dependent arising are foundational. They are in the discourses of the Buddha, memorized by monks during his lifetime and transmitted orally for 200 years after his death, until they were written down in the sutras known as the Pali Canon. But their implications, especially as the framework for experiences in deep meditation that can radically transform the mind, are now being looked at from the viewpoint of modernity, as Western Dharma teachers try to distinguish the essence of Buddhism from its Asian cultural constructs. But separating culture from religion is not an easy task. James Shaheen is the editor of Tricycle, the Buddhist Review.
A lot of people think that there's a pure Buddhism and then there's a lot of cultural baggage. I don't see it that way because I can't really distinguish culture from the religion of Buddhism itself. I do know that, and a lot of people don't even call it a religion. I happen to think it is a religion. So it's not possible really to strip it down to its bare essentials, I don't think. Because it's inseparable from culture. It comes from people. And it does, however, evolve in different cultural contexts. And every time that happens, people are going to have to ask themselves, what is baby and what is bathwater? Now, that's not an easy thing to answer. Look at Alan Wallace and Stephen Batchelor. They have two very different takes or responses to the very same tradition.
In the 1970s, Alan Wallace and Stephen Batchelor were fellow Tibetan monks. Today, Alan Wallace is a Dharma teacher and scientist based in Santa Barbara, California, and in Thailand, where he directs the Phuket International Academy Mind Center and runs intensive 8-week shamatha meditation retreats for his Western students.
Is it true or is it not that people have past lives? Can we explore this rigorously, objectively, so that it stands up to even the most careful scrutiny?
An experienced practitioner of long-term solitary retreats, he is very traditional in his opinions about some of the new interpretive currents emerging in Western Buddhism.
As Buddhism moves into modernity, it's facing perhaps its greatest challenge and its greatest opportunity since its inception. On the one hand, we find the secularization of Buddhism. There is, of course, a lot of antipathy towards religion of any kind by many secular people in the modern world. And so some people with this, at least a great sense of unease and perhaps actual antipathy towards religion, then look at Buddhism and they look at it and say, well, this is a religion too, or at least has very major religious aspects, but we can salvage it. We can salvage it. We can save Buddhism. And that is, we'll just take what we like. And that is, we like mindfulness. We like the cultivation of loving kindness. We like the ethical principles of nonviolence. We like compassion. And what winds up coming out of this very selective approach is Buddhism really then is reincarnated, so to speak, or it evolves and mutates into something that I would say is tantamount to a new school of psychology. It's heavily psychologized, all references to what the promoters of this approach deem metaphysical, such things as the continuity of individual consciousness after death, the re-embodiment of consciousness, so we call it reincarnation or rebirth, the nature of karma, the patterns or regularities of karma, often called the laws of karma, the qualities of enlightenment itself, and then claims about the higher capacities in terms of heightened awareness, paranormal qualities or abilities. Either marginalize these things as if they're not really important, or just flat out say this is part of the superstition of Buddhism, and everything that does not, I would say, correspond to or is not compatible with scientific materialism and the discoveries of science now, oh, the Buddha never taught that. The Buddha never dealt with metaphysics, as if metaphysics is one category that we defined, and then it's a universal, that what is beyond our experience is beyond everybody's experience. That's just ethnocentrism and a type of really intellectual colonialism.
The target of much of Alan Wallace's criticism is the ideas of his fellow Tibetan monk of old, Stephen Batchelor, a writer, artist, and Dharma teacher based near Bordeaux in France. If Alan is among the most traditional of Western Buddhist teachers, Stephen would certainly be among the most reform-minded. The ideas in his latest book are highly controversial. Nevertheless, they are getting a wide hearing in the Buddhist community. Based on his research into the Pali Canon, he has reached an unconventional interpretation of what the Buddha actually taught.
I'm basing my work at the moment on my reading, and I think a fairly close reading, of certain early texts within the Pali tradition. And also, I'm basing my work on my own practice of nearly 40 years of trying to understand these teachings, not just intellectually, but also through contemplation, meditation, reflection, through my work. You see, for me, the practice of the Dharma engages the whole of one's life. The Buddha spoke of it as the Eightfold Path. That's actually a cummerbund that I found in a dumpster. And that used to be just a supermarket shopping bag. To me, the practice is the cultivation of all 8 aspects of that path, including reflection, including the work you do, including your ethical relationships, including your spiritual practices, including your view of the world. Right. And for me, therefore, a practice cannot be reduced simply to becoming proficient in certain meditative skills. Mm-hmm. I certainly would not dismiss the importance of that, but I would insist that meditation practice always be contextualized by the wider frame of the Eightfold Path itself. In other words, the way of life that the Buddha encouraged, rather than reductively saying, this kind of meditative insight is the key to enlightenment.
The central point around which all of Buddhism revolves is the enlightenment of the Buddha. The nirvana that he stated is the potential of everyone, and many since are said to have realized. But what is it? From the mid-1930s on, through his writings and lectures in English, the Japanese Zen scholar D.T. Suzuki had great influence on the later development of Buddhism in the West. Suzuki had been trained in the Rinzai Zen tradition, which emphasizes satori or kensho, a sudden enlightenment experience transcending normal dualistic consciousness, where one directly knows the ultimate nature of reality. Later Japanese teachers, mostly of the Soto school, like the San Francisco Zen Center's Shunryu Suzuki, downplayed the importance of this kind of experience, and instead emphasized the gradual dawning of the awakened mind in and as meditation practice.
He was following Dogen's teaching, which was Zazen. Not just Zazen, but Zazen is enlightenment. So he always emphasized the practice. Just do the practice. Don't try to do it for some reason. Don't try to get something out of practice. So his practice was really the purest practice because there was no, it was not intended to get anything. It's simply just you do something for nothing. And as soon as you start to want something, it's no longer pure practice.
If you look in the text, the way the Buddha taught, he said, awakening happens gradually and slowly like the great oceans go deeper and deeper and deeper as you follow out from the shoreline. And then in another text, he says, stream entry, the dropping away of all illusions of self and separation happens in a flash, in a moment. And enlightenment itself can be this great dramatic moment of release from the separate body of fear or the small sense of self into the vast awakening of the heart that is our true nature. Which is true? As is always the case in these beautiful Buddhist teachings, yes. Yes is the answer.
The traditional understanding that resolves this seeming paradox is that each approach emphasizes different aspects of the path towards Buddhahood or arhatship. Sudden glimpses of non-duality can set the compass heading towards the state of enlightenment, but the mind still needs to mature through gradual practice and deepening insight into emptiness, the non-self nature of reality. However, today many in Western Buddhism give these experiences less credence because they question something even more basic, that there is such a thing as the enlightened state.
The concept that everybody in the West had in the beginning, you know, of the enlightened master, and the goal was enlightenment, and everybody would come and try to get enlightened, and the place was run by an enlightened master who would have an enlightened successor, and everybody was groping for that goal. That was never the case. That was never the case in Asia. It was never the case anywhere. That even, it was a projection of us. We American young people. It was a romantic, idealistic, individualistic projection, which was aided and abetted by the Asian teachers who came here, who were influenced by that view themselves. So in other words, almost all the Asian teachers who came here were aware of Western thought, were aware of Western psychology, were aware of, you know, the enlightenment lust that people had, and spoke to that.
But what is Buddhahood? I mean, I studied with Zen teachers who talk about small satoris and big satoris, and I know the Tibetan description of the Bodhisattva bhumis, but honestly, I have not found one single teacher up to now who could present to me in his life, in his person or her person, and in the way they were they could explain the path, that I have a clear image of what enlightenment is, except the lists I have learned. So, I don't know.
Of course, people claim experiences, and I have no reason to doubt the veracity of what they say, but unfortunately, simply to make a first-person claim, it does not carry a lot of explanatory power. the more for such first-person claims there were, the more authority they might have. But I feel that for the Dharma to be articulated in our day and age, we need somehow to bring together both our powers of reason, our philosophies, our scientific understanding of the world, as well as the kinds of experiences that are opened up to us in the practice of meditation itself. And again, I don't want to privilege one particular experience, let's say, of non-duality, and give that some kind of prestige, rather than recognizing how the Dhamma and the stream in which one enters is something that engages the whole of one's experience. And so I don't have much time, frankly, for these ideas of non-duality.
And where is the authority? And who has experienced enlightenment to start with that they can talk about?
Mathieu Ricard, once a geneticist, is now a Tibetan monk in the Nyingma Dzogchen tradition that emphasizes the non-dual state of enlightenment as the aim of Buddhist practice.
So you see there's a difference between rambling with ideas and then what came out of the Buddha's enlightenment, that's his teachings, the commentaries that are proposed, an elucidation of the Buddha's word by people like Nagarjuna, and then the great masters of the tradition in Tibet, and up to modern realized teachers like those we're lucky enough to meet. So, I mean, those, they refer directly to their own realization. And plus, if you need, they will come with a perfectly logical and based on the scripture. They have an immense knowledge of the scripture. They have immense experience. So how can you put that on the scale? You know, put the whole Buddha's teaching on one side and somebody's idea on the other side. You know, they're going to be projected right in space.
The nature of the Enlightenment experience by ordinary people is inconceivable. And therefore, they tend to collapse it into one of two options. One option is a kind of annihilation of everything, where nirvana is an other world of no experience at all, because they cannot imagine blissful experience, ecstatic, all experiences, even what we normally would think of as pain, as ecstatic. They cannot imagine a state like that. So they think nirvana must be an annihilation of consciousness, of subjectivity. So that's one extreme. And the other extreme is they collapse it into being some sort of euphemistic, kind of little bit deceptive way of luring people into resignation to ordinariness, full resignation into ordinariness.
Some things you shouldn't hear about now yet, because they only confuse you. And you make strange ideas about it, you know. And people start, within the Buddhist world, you know, let's be fair. Sometimes people start quarreling about if somebody is enlightened or not. Or if enlightenment is existing or not. Or if a normal being can become enlightened or not. I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
If indeed the ultimate goal of Buddhism is Buddhahood or arhatship, it does require a great amount of practice. And traditionally, Asian Buddhists have accepted that it is an ongoing process over multiple lifetimes. But scientifically educated Westerners tend to be skeptical that any aspect of consciousness can traverse death. And so many Western Buddhists are agnostic about rebirth, or take the attitude that it is a cultural remnant of Buddhism's Indian roots, rather than a foundational realization in advanced meditation practice.
I mean, first, rebirth is a speculation. Rebirth is a concept. I would say rebirth is an expectation aimed at justice, which is not observable.
I personally don't take it too literally. Rebirth is a conception in our mind. We don't know.
Ton Lathouwers, a retired professor of Slavic literature, teaches Rinzai Zen in the Netherlands and Belgium. His group has chanted the sutras to Russian Orthodox liturgical melodies, and he uses Western existentialist writers in his teachings.
maybe that is for me the most important in Buddhism, that not giving an answer, but keeping it all open. Like a Korean Zen master, I was once for a month in his monastery, Sungsan, he always said, Buddhism is don't know mind. What is Buddhism? And he said in meditation, he said, don't know. What is rebirth? Don't know. That was something very beautiful. That was close to what I found in Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard. That is the failure of language and words, whatever they are.
In the traditional understanding of rebirth, one's underlying stream of moment-to-moment consciousness is reborn because of karma, the causal seeds planted by past intentional actions. Carola Roloff is a Tibetan nun doing postdoctoral research at the University of Hamburg.
His teaching on karma and rebirth was the reason why I converted from Protestant Christianity to Buddhism, because I was looking for what is the reason for suffering, you know, and I couldn't believe that God is giving suffering to the sentient beings if He has created everything.
I don't think that there's any way in which we can dispense of the concept of reincarnation and truly practice Buddhism in a serious way.
Geshe Nicholas Vreeland is the director of the Tibet Center in New York and a monk of Ratu Monastery in South India.
Whether we are making our way towards the attainment of nirvana or peace or a state beyond cyclic existence, or whether we're making our way towards the attainment of Buddhahood as a Mahayana Buddhist practitioner would, it will take many, many lifetimes of practice. And so to limit one's scope from the start to this lifetime is not really really making use of what Buddhism is all about.
But I'm not open to the fact of adhering to those doctrines simply because tradition requires me to, and particularly a tradition where you can find a number of passages in the earliest canon where the Buddha himself speaks very dismissively of being concerned about what happens after death, for example. I mean, it's not, you know, clear-cut. The Buddha is ambivalent. Some passages have him speaking about rebirth, others have him rather skeptical about it. But I think what the Buddha was probably saying was that this sort of conversation we're having now is actually kind of missing the point. That to get so preoccupied with issues that are basically tangential to the core practice is basically a waste of time.
Simply because we don't understand something, that doesn't mean that the whole Buddhist tradition for 2,500 years has come up with no discoveries at all, and that the Buddha didn't make any really profound discoveries on the night of his enlightenment. And so, what I'm calling for here, encouraging, is not just belief that, oh, the Buddha said this, let's all believe. The Buddha himself didn't suggest that or encourage it. He suggested people to be critical, but not critical in a closed-minded fashion, believing only one's own culture or only science has some unique, how do you say, approach to understanding reality. But very deep forms of meditation may also reveal some of the most important truths about the nature of consciousness.
What exactly it is that is reborn. Is it me? No. Is it my unfinished business? Probably, yes. And then is it reborn by some kind of magical device dropping into the zygote when sperm and egg get together and the third bit comes in, plop, and that's your karma? Is it like that, which some Tibetans would argue? Or is it, as a Westerner such as myself might argue, to say that there is the biological inheritance, which you could, if you want, call biological karma, namely the genome, and then after that, because of the cleverness of our genome, we begin to acquire learning from parents, schools, and the whole cultural stuff comes in with its prejudices, its likes, its dislikes, the whole karmic stuff which creates our trouble in life. So, I mean, when I hear about reincarnation, I usually think that this is the reincarnation of karma which has come from preceding generations, and we've learnt it, we've acquired it through culture. It's not been dropped in some magical way into our zygote. That's my own view, but then I'm a biologist, so I would think that way.
If you look at the notion of a continuum of consciousness, because after all, rebirth is about that. Right. Now, everything else is culture. Yeah. in the West. It's completely out of the culture to believe in rebirth. In the East, it's so common that you don't even question it. But the real question is, what's the nature of consciousness? From Buddhism, the analysis is very clear. The immediately preceding event that triggers the next one, there has to be some kind of coherence of nature. You cannot go from, in one instant, being a seed of wheat, and then the next instant, here you have an apple. There is a continuum in the, so that means a totally inanimate instant, the next instance, there's a break of continuity if it's conscious, and then instant right preceding that is not. Okay. So of course the big picture is a meta picture, like the evolution of species when the complexification of the nervous system, but that's a long story. It's not in the milliseconds.
The Tibetan Tulku system institutionalizes rebirth, having sought out new emanations of previous great teachers for many hundreds of years. James Gimian is the publisher of the Shambhala-san magazine and Buddha Dharma, the Practitioner's Quarterly. He was a student of the late Tulku, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and he believes that the ultimate value of the Tulku system is not whether it's based on the truth of rebirth.
The 16th to the 17th Gyalwa Karmapa is a good example. In the 1970s and through 1981 when he died, the 16th Gyalwa Karmapa was a wonderful inspiration of Buddhist practice throughout North America and the West as he toured 3 times and taught. He died in 1981, but there has now arisen in the form of a fellow who's 22 years old, his successor, the 17th Karmapa, who has just made his first trip 2 years ago to the West. He presents the continuity of the inspiration of a way of practicing and being as a human being. What does that mean to the thousands of followers? Do they have to believe that some magical transmission of a human personality went somewhere for 14 years and then re-emerged in a little baby? Or do they experience the continuity of a particular wisdom that helps them? I think the proof of the Tulku system isn't about whether rebirth or reincarnation is true. It's about whether the succession of teachers actually bring benefit to human beings.
In the Tulku system, as in any institution, human politics often becomes part of the conversation, especially when considerable wealth and power is inherited along with the title. The recognition of the aforementioned 17th Karmapa, for example, is in dispute, with an alternative candidate being promoted by a prominent disciple of the previous incarnation. The dispute has at times been acrimonious and has boiled over into Western Dharma centers.
This is something that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting to be compromised by other people's politics. It's quite, whichever way I go, one's compromised. And when my students ask me what are they to think of it, again, I don't want to compromise them, but there's no way out of it.
The controversy has caused one Western Lama to question if the Tulku institution should be part of Tibetan Buddhism in the West. Denny Tundrup Rinpoche is the spiritual director of Karma Ling, a retreat and teaching center in the French Alps.
It made big problems. Just look at the situation. I don't need to comment. So, and it had in the traditional society some regulation, but that don't work in the West. And so it's a system without regulation, and it's not a Buddhist system. It's kind of more feudal. We don't really need that in the West.
Just as the essence of the Dharma is coming under scrutiny, entirely new schools have emerged that are not transplanted from Asian roots. One of the largest is the Triratna Buddhist community, headquartered in England but located in over 20 countries. Formerly the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, they were founded by Urgyen Sankarakshita, an Englishman who spent 16 years in South Asia as a monk. Returning to Britain in the mid-60s, he saw the need to create a new kind of Buddhist community, faithful to traditional Buddhist doctrines, but neither lay nor monastic, with an emphasis on community living and team-based right livelihood businesses that would form the nucleus of a new kind of society.
Right livelihood is an integral part of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. So I started thinking about this years ago, in fact, when I was in India. What is right livelihood? And I came to the conclusion that it wasn't possible to lead a fully effective Buddhist life without there being some change, some improvement in the life of the society in the midst of which you lived, especially changes economically speaking. We've elaborated over the years the conception of what has come to be called within our movement team-based right livelihood. That it wasn't just a question of the rightness, ethically speaking, of one's personal livelihood. It was also a question of working together with other Buddhists who shared one's ideals, and through working together created a context for a more intensive development of what we call spiritual friendship, as well as the urban centers, the country retreat centers, the team-based right livelihood businesses. There are also the residential spiritual communities. So these go to make up our Triratna Buddhist movement. And we see it as constituting the nucleus, and I use this word nucleus advisedly, of a new society.
The notion that individuals and their societies can be free of greed, selfishness, and injustice is implicit within the Buddhist enlightenment. They are the causal result of ignorance of the non-self nature of things, and are extinguished by the compassion that flows directly from the awakened heart. In the West, that compassion has resulted in the emergence of a socially engaged Buddhism. About 30 years ago, Bernie Glassman Roshi started doing street retreats, living among homeless people.
One thing that happens when you live in the streets, you're living in the moment. That's something we're trying to get people to experience, and it's easy to get them to experience that in the streets. But after the retreat was over, what struck me was that the only religious groups or spiritual groups that were assisting folks in the streets were Christian. Well, a little after that, I did a very big program called Graceland, which worked with the homeless in Yonkers at a large scale. That's me about 30 years ago.
His economic development initiatives, Greystone Bakery and Foundation, grew into multi-million-dollar enterprises and provided work, services, and low-cost housing for the poorest members of the Yonkers, New York community, where he was based until a half a dozen years ago.
So that's with he's my clown teacher.
At that time, he divested himself of all administrative positions and was looking forward to freedom from their time-draining responsibilities. But instead, his community prevailed upon him to start something new, and he purchased an abandoned anti-nuclear commune in western Massachusetts.
I had given away everything. I had been an abbot of a few places, installed abbots of those places. I installed somebody to run Graceland. I had no assets. I did not want that. I wanted the streets to be my headquarters. And then there were people that said, you know, we really should have a mother house. There should be something for the future. It's not just you, Bernie. You can't just live in the streets.
And you couldn't say no to that.
And yeah, eventually I gave in. Part of me regrets it because I'm wound up back in the raising monies and paying off debts and all of that. And I had gotten at that time to a place where it was, I didn't have anything, and I didn't have any. It was the freedom of the streets, which I've always loved. But I understand the importance for the future.
Bernie has found numerous ways to apply Zen. He started the Zen Peacemakers Order in the 1980s, which now has 70 affiliates on 5 continents. And he's been leading retreats to Auschwitz since 1994. Over the last few years, he's begun the prototype of a new program.
What we call Zen houses, which would be places for Dharma practitioners to practice their Dharma and to serve the community. I want every Zen house to have what I'm calling a cafe. The motto of our cafe is fine food, music, games, puppetry, and wellness. And I also have another theme for our cafe, which is service with dignity, service with love. So if you come to our cafe, you can't tell who's poor, who's rich. During the meal, we have entertainment, music, different kinds of, we're part of a marching band. We have magicians, we have hikes into the woods. And then after the meal, we provide various kinds of wellness components. We have a medical director, so we can actually provide medical checkups and advice. And we have an AA meeting that happens. So this is a model for soup kitchens that I want to replicate across the country. I define enlightenment as realizing and actualizing the interdependence of life, the oneness of life. The way you can tell the depth of a person's enlightenment is by how they serve others.
People ask me, what has Judaism brought to Buddhism? And I say humor, a very important element.
You know, Roland Resch is one of the principal students of the late Taizen Deshimeru, who brought Zen to France in the 1960s and founded the Association Zen Internationale, today the largest Zen group in Europe. He has a more traditional Buddhist approach to social engagement.
I think the idea is good, principle, fantastic. Huh? But in practice, I think we're at the beginning of planting the Dharma in the West. And if we spend too much time on bakeries and things like that, it takes a lot of energy. And what I am doing is I'm teaching all kinds of people. I advise them to really practice the Dharma in their professions. I have a lot of doctors and nurses, for example, in my Sangha. And those people, I advise them that when they are working as a doctor or as a nurse, should make it really their Dharma practice. But I am not going to make a Zen hospital. It is better to be true bodhisattva, and I strongly believe necessary to practice in temples, to practice in dojos in the right form, you know, and respecting the tradition. And from that, jump into society and mix with people and bring our practice into society.
One of the effects of post-industrial modernity is that all forms of spiritual teaching live in close proximity to one another, often in the same neighborhood. The kinds of distorted ideas about other Buddhist traditions that existed in Asia are less sustainable when practitioners can easily listen to teachers from other schools, often as guests within their own centers.
It had been that if you went to Burma and talked about Tibetan Buddhism, many of the Burmese believed Tibetan Buddhism to be some weird, perverted form of Hindu Tantra, which had images of the Buddha in carnal positions with women, and they couldn't believe it was Buddhism. And if you talk to the Burmese when they would go, or the Thais when they would go and visit Japan and see Zen masters hitting people with sticks, they would as one of my great Burmese masters said, this can't be Buddhism. And the Buddha never taught us to hit people with sticks. This is an aberration. Or you have the Zen people who would look at Theravada and say, oh, that's only low class, they don't have emptiness. Or the Tibetans who would think it was Hinayanas. And basically they hadn't talked to each other for 1,000 or 1,500 years. Now, at Spirit Rock, at our center at IMS, even though we're very much rooted in our tradition, we also have had this deep dialogue with other traditions, and it's happening everywhere. Our own teachers have trained primarily in Theravada and Vipassana practice, but almost everyone has also trained in Tibetan Vajrayana practice and in Zen practice, and brings in those sensibilities. And this is part of the beauty of what's happening in the West at this time, is that we're able to draw on and learn, not in a potpourri way, but in a deep understanding the best skillful means of these traditions and see actually how they fit together.
A further elaboration on this transcending of sectarian differences occurs when the close proximity of different religions encourages an effort to increase mutual understanding. Sometimes, though, it can create backfires. Norman Fisher borrows from his Zen experience to teach a class in Jewish meditation.
As we sit, we have an attitude of openness and curiosity for whatever else would arise in our mind or heart.
Rabbi Lou, my colleague and dear friend who founded Makor Or with me, he would do Jewish teachings and I would do Zen teachings, and we would do this thing side by side. And it became really a problem because we were inviting comparisons, you know, and we were kind of ended up doing retreats that were comparative religion. And it wasn't that good because then you're always comparing and it gets theoretical. And furthermore, a lot of the Jewish people were comparing Judaism quite unfavorably to Buddhism because the people who were coming to the retreats were people who liked Buddhism and were drawn to the Buddhism part and wanted to vent, you know, their problems with Judaism. So this was very hard on the poor rabbi. So eventually we decided to just make it Jewish meditation and not have any reference to Buddhism, and to be honest and tell people, well, we were just borrowing a technique that we both learned in an unbroken lineage that was strong, and we were taking that technique and applying it to Judaism.
A more contentious development is when the boundaries between different religions get blurred, through adopting another's practice, complete with its name and forms. A number of Christian clerics, for example, have received Zen transmission, mostly from one Japanese Roshi, and have proceeded to teach what they call Zen meditation, even encouraging the Kensho experience, but without the Buddhist doctrinal framework that illuminates its meaning.
And the framework really matters, you know, the idea that there's some ineffable something that transcends all frameworks. If that's theoretically true, it really doesn't make any difference because as soon as you open up your mouth and as soon as you are a person, you're in a framework. Yeah. And so the frameworks do matter quite a bit.
My own teacher, Master Shen Yen, made the point that practice must be dependent upon concept, and that the concept of the practice of Zen is the Four Noble Truths and the law of codependent arising, all of that. So any master who, as it were, transmits to somebody just because they've had a Kensho experience and who want to go and talk about their experience within the Christian context, from my teacher's point of view, that is rubbish.
Well, one of the big issues is whether or not Buddhist practices can be taken out of their native context. For instance, mindfulness, which has become a big craze. So everybody's talking about mindfulness. There's all sorts of scientific inquiry associated with mindfulness. And people in some traditions are concerned that mindfulness by itself is not Buddhism. And the Dalai Lama said, it may be mindfulness, but it's not Buddhism, once to Alan Wallace. So taken out of its context, while it may be very helpful, and people like John Kabat-Zinn have done great work with it to alleviate suffering, which is pretty fundamental, others are concerned that people will mistake it for Buddhism and shortchange themselves or the traditions that produce this.
Where is Western Buddhism heading in the future? There are many trends that raise questions about the dilution of the practice, the de-emphasis on enlightenment, the willingness by some to jettison what others consider essential doctrines, such as rebirth, and the popularization of Buddhist meditation techniques outside of their Buddhist context, all conditioned by the demands of modern life that place lay rather than monastic practice at the center of the Western Buddhist mandala. But can lay practitioners make enough time and effort within their scattered, demanding lives to do depth practice? Or will Dharma light become the norm of Western Buddhism?
I think it's a big question, because I see that Americans, for the most part, would rather do something in 2 years and become enlightened. Yeah. Or they don't want to do these long retreats. They don't want to do all the long foundational practices of Anundra with the 100,000s of prostrations and the 100-syllable mantra, etc. They don't want to learn the succession of ritual practices that are very important in Tibetan Buddhism in order to really develop the kind of realization and maturity in the practice. And so the question is, how can the real power and integrity of the Dharma teachings be preserved in the generations that are to come?
The challenge, however, we mustn't forget, lies in the laity. That's where our problem lies. It's how are the lay people to find some new values in this extraordinarily materialistic and self-based, consumerist ecology of our time.
Practice, I think, is a word that we really need to rethink. And essentially, we need to enlarge it so that one's communication becomes a practice. One's bodily interaction with others ethically is a practice. One's work becomes a practice. Rather than thinking that my practice is my private spiritual exercise, and then on the basis of that, I build the rest of my life.
My students have told me, Professor Willis, that's not quite fair. If we do it this way, by picking and choosing, by being free, by mixing traditions, that is American Buddhism. That's going to be the American Buddhism. Stop resisting. And I say, but I want to be able to recognize it. You know, do I call it psychology? Do I call it stress reduction? Do I call it art? I want to be able to recognize that that's Buddhism. So I'm old hat. Old traditionalist, conservative. I have to chuckle, even though I worry about it. I worry that something's going to be lost.
From my standpoint, I say that everybody has the ingredients they have, and they make the best offerings they have. So if there are offerings being made and somebody else says, well, that's watering down, well, there's always millions of offerings being made. And for those who are ready and only ready to work with those methods that look like they're watering down things, so that's the right thing, and it's moving them a step or whatever. And for those who want other things, they'll find other things, because there's all these. It's like a buffet table, you know. There's all these dishes being offered by all these people. And people walk into the room and they're drawn to certain dishes. And then those people change. A year later, they would go to another dish.
No, you cannot make your own menu, especially when it comes to the root of the Dharma, which to get rid of ego grasping. There is no compromission there, and to exchange a Ferrari for a Maruti car is not going to work.
There are people who live among us in normal business activity and careers who are dedicating 100 days a year to deep retreat practice, who are dedicating 2 to 3 hours a day of meditation practice that they weave into their so-called normal lives. And this is a very deep connection to practice. And I think that sometimes when we focus only on the way in which popular magazines appropriate mindfulness, we lose sight that there are thousands of Westerners with a deep connection to the Dharma who aren't doing purely the monastic tradition, as it was known or was done in the East, but are really mixing that deep, transformative Buddhist meditation practice with their everyday role in the society and life in the West.
What about the next generation? Will they carry the torch of the Dharma into the future? Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado started out as a Buddhist school in the 1970s. It has since become ecumenical.
We have about 1,200 students, and of course they have many different kinds of backgrounds. Most of them don't have any plan to be Buddhist, but they want to learn to meditate.
I don't really resonate with any religion or practice per se. I am interested in a spiritual journey.
Just the whole idea that beings are suffering and that the Buddha said that there was a way out of suffering, that's kind of what drew me here. And then now it's a little more murky and complicated than that.
I think that my initial thoughts on Buddhism was that it wasn't like a religion, and then when I took a class on it, I really realized that it was like a religion. I found a lot of the same contradictions. I'm also Jewish, but I found that the same contradictions that I found in learning about Judaism, I found in Buddhism. The way that they would tell you how to act or how to be a bodhisattva, but then in how I actually saw people acting it out were two very different things.
There's a general toughness amongst young people as a means of self-preservation. I mean, they have heard so much bullshit that they say, I cannot appear like the people who are so full of shit. I've got to put something in my nose, I got to put a dot on my, not a dot on my head, a tattoo down my head. So I think that the people are more aware and more suffering from apathy.
Within the generational tectonic plates, new forms of Buddhism are emerging. Stephen and Andrea Levine are Dharma teachers and writers who live a hermit existence in the mountains above Taos, New Mexico. Their son Noah has become a Dharma teacher himself after a difficult youth. While he was in prison for drug charges, things changed for him when he decided to try, his words, Dad's hippie meditation bullshit.
See that flat-topped, right, all at the furthest there? Yeah. That's a volcano.
We're hearing more younger people, Noah's people, since you're talking about Noah, is that think that we're a failure, that the 60s were a failure and everything that we did was a failure.
Which is why someone like him, who's teaching the people with multiple tattoos and rings through their nose and studs in their tongues and all the lovely things that just make us, our shoulders go up. So I think that the younger people are finding a different way of approaching the Dharma, and particularly the more plain spoken, the less the Dharma idiom is in Indian or Buddha mouth, the better it is for young people.
But there are also trends emerging of young people working within the traditions adopted by their parents' generation. Lama Tsultrim Elion's son Costanzo is a very serious retreatant, and one of many young people spending time at Taramandala.
I think my generation's different from maybe, you know, the hippie generation in a sense that the hippies were really rebelling.
Who wants tea?
And I think my generation, we don't really have that to the same extent. We're trying to integrate what's in front of us already and build on top of that. I personally don't see myself as, you know, rebelling against the system. I'm more just trying to take it home and make it part of my daily life.
Whenever Buddhism has migrated to a new culture, it has changed, but so has the culture, sometimes in significant ways. That Buddhism is adapting to modernity is clear, but what, if any, effect is it having on modernity? One clear influence is through mindfulness practice, which is getting increasing use in health and education. But another is in the dialogue and research initiatives established with psychology and the neurosciences, mostly with the encouragement of the Dalai Lama.
You know, at MIT meeting, we had 1,000 scientists in the audience, 5 Nobel Prize. His Holiness gave the opening address to the neuroscience meeting, 25,000 neuroscientists. There was 600 people who were against it. Yeah. And when the door opened, they were running to the first row, and Richard Davidson said, in 20 years, I never saw any address or opening where people were running. So there's something there. Well, compared to 20 years ago, it's a gigantic step.
to a very large extent, cognitive scientists have not been that open or willing to question their own assumptions. And so they just ignore evidence that contradicts their very cherished metaphysical beliefs. So that has to go. And Buddhists have to overcome, we Buddhists have to overcome our own sense of dogmatism and complacency in our own assumptions. But if we can do that and come together in an open-minded, radically empirical way where we're willing to be critical of our own assumptions, a whole new discipline could arise that would have implications for ethics, for mental health, understanding the mind, consciousness, and the role of consciousness in the natural world.
The Buddhist scientific tradition, the Buddhist psychological meditational tradition, and the Buddhist ethical and political tradition, those services that the insider community offered to the many societies in which it was found useful, is offering it to the planet today, and that is essential to the planet's survival. That will reinforce the good aspects of all the world religions without competing with them. It will reinforce the good aspects of secular humanism. It will reinforce the good aspects of scientific investigation of the nature of reality, both internal, psychological, mental reality, as well as external physical reality. And it is of great essence, actually, in the world, not as a religion and not as a religious missionarization of the world, but as a scientific, political, psychological, and ethical service offering and service accessing for the world's population. That is what is critical.
So where is this two-way street between the Buddha Dharma and modernity headed? The history of the West has been built upon the foundation of the Judeo-Christian religions, which place the relationship between the self and a creator God at the center of reality. As that God has become increasingly displaced by the growth of science, modernity, the self alone, is staggering towards its future, addicted to consumption, worshiping greed, placing its faith in technological innovation to save it from environmental Armageddon, and indulging in escapist entertainment to avert its eyes from the encroaching future. The Buddha Dharma's coming to the West brings a different understanding of reality, a deep ecology of interdependence, where the totality of the whole, not the self, is at the center. Perhaps the time has come for that understanding to sink in, or perhaps, like the addict, we are not yet ready to let go of self-centeredness until we hit rock bottom, the turning point at which the addict may or may not survive.
Wilt u naar aanleiding van deze uitzending reageren of een gratis programmagids bestellen? Bezoek dan onze website boeddhistischeomroep.nl. DVD's van onze programma's kunt u bestellen op 010 411 3977.